It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is my friend David Amerland, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Intentional: How to Live, Love, Work, and Play Meaningfully. David, it is always a pleasure to speak with you. Welcome back to the show.
Shaun, thank you very much. It's been a long time, and I'm really glad to be here.
Oh, yes. I've so been looking forward to this. I was realizing in preparing for this interview that it has been a while. The show has grown. We have new people that watch and listen. So let's kick this off by having you share a little bit of the David Amerland origin story for somebody meeting you for the first time in our talk today. Give us a little bit of context. What do they need to know about you?
Well, 30,000 feet view. I'm a chemical engineer by education, MSc in quantum mechanics. I did time as a journalist for a while, went to business journalism, and then sort of got involved with search and marketing and digital marketing. And, writing comes natural to me. So here we are a little bit later. This is book number 18.
What you just described sounds like you've had like 17 careers. That's a lot of things to fit into the time that you've been on this earth. And I think some of that we've not covered before. So I'm glad I asked again. I think I learned a couple new things about you with that answer. I was delighted and maybe a little bit surprised to see how you open the book, that you include a little bit of your story in there just to give the reader some context. I was kind of curious. Why did you feel compelled to do that?
Well, in every book, you've got to ask yourself, who has written this and why, really? And also, when you ask that, you're really seeking for some kind of confirmation that what they're bringing is worth your time. There's value in that. And they're filtering it in as unbiased a way as possible, really. So essentially, writing this book, I had to ask myself, why me? Why wouldn't somebody else do it? So I'm not a neuroscientist by training or a psychologist, although after 6 years of working in this field, I have, quite a good working knowledge of it. I sort of had to think, what is it I'm actually bringing in there? And my lifestyle, the way I sort of grew up and worked and how my career developed, allowed me to develop unique skills, which basically made the book come together.
And one of the things you disclose is that you moved around a lot, and you often kind of out of necessity were part of a grander whole than necessarily like smaller, more intimate groups.
Yeah, it's
was that kind of a skill, a superpower? Because I feel like we all have certain things that were unique that we develop, but that also like give us an edge later in life. I'm curious, how has that played out for you?
Well, I'm so glad you brought this up now, okay? Because essentially, you have to ask yourself, and I ask myself all the time, why am I the way that I am? Why am I not different? And here's what it is. Essentially, we all have the same essential lines, same essential code, if you like, which is our operating system. It's there to help us survive. To do that, it does a couple of things like, it looks to see if there's any threats we can identify, any sort of potential rewards we can get very quickly for very little effort. And also, it needs for us to belong to something. And in order to do that, what happens? We grow up in a place, we have friends, family, we have connections, we have careers, we have depth, we put down roots, and those become our support network, which allows us to survive better, easier. I didn't have that. Every so often, my family would just pick up and move. And even in my adult life, I had to change countries fairly frequently because of work. I have the same drive, however. I'm not different to anybody else. So because I couldn't put down roots, I had to find a way of operating differently. And every time after I analyzed that, I realized that what I did was I looked to see how I can contribute to the particular group I'm at. And then I did that at a really high level. So I had to put in a lot of work to analyze how can I bring in value which other people didn't. And after a while, that sort of changes the way you see reality. It allows you to synthesize things a lot more quickly, a lot faster, filter them really, really fast in order to bring the value of the moment to the surface. And that's me, basically. That's why the book came about.
And in terms of your body of writing, is this kind of logically a follow-up or an extension of some of the work you started in the Sniper Mind? I felt like you touched on some of the same things.
That's right, yes. I mean, Sniper Mind is a much broader book, and essentially it looks at the skill set that we bring in from the military sort of way of operating, if you like, and the way of thinking, and then we apply that to business. And in order to sort of show how this actually works, back then I had to do a lot of research in neuroscience and social psychology and anthropology. And then intentional, which also took 3 years to research and write, sort of grew from the seeds that I sort of put together from this with the Sniper Mind. So a lot of the things that I was thinking about then in a much broader environment came down to the individual, because when we look at a business or a community or a country or the globe, well, those massive entities we actually look at are made up of individuals. It is our individual behavior, our belief system, our ideas, the way we operate with each other and the way we connect and how we function at an individual level that actually make those entities possible. So this is very much personal, but if you take it to a business setting, it has a very very valuable sort of insight to bring in the way you operate there, and you can generalize it to a much bigger subset of perhaps a society or a city or a country or a nation. So it can work like that as well.
And in terms of the process of learning how to live intentional, is it an ever evolving, always ongoing process? Kind of like you peel back one layer of the onion and then you deal with the stuff there and then you kind of go back to start and start over. I feel like you could really go deep, continually working to try to get to know yourself and improve yourself. Like it'd be a lifelong journey.
It can be, and some other fact it is, because, and then we have to ask why. I mean, why can't somebody just tell us who we are? We accept that, and that's it. We go from there. Well, it doesn't work that way, because we are a constant fluid entity. I mean, just our sense of identity is an ever evolving narrative, which is being edited by our brain as we go along. So how we make the choices at editorial level, how we choose what to synthesize, why we choose that is key to who we are. Who we are changes according to our belief system, our knowledge, our experiences, our aims, our goals. So all those things together go into making all these things up. Does it sound complex? Yeah, absolutely. That's what it is, And does it ever get us there, wherever that there may be? Well, no, we're never done, basically. Our life constantly evolves, the situation around us constantly changes. And we know from ourselves, even if we stay in one place, surrounded by the same people all our lives, those people experience different situations which challenge them. And then their challenges get passed on to us in the connections and relationships we have with them. So then we are challenged. We constantly evolve.
And in terms of the audience that was in your mind's eye when you were working on this project, I think on the one hand, people see a book like this and like, oh, that's for the business leader or the executive or the this or the that. But I'm going to assume you had a much broader, hopefully brighter, but broader audience in mind for this. Who were you thinking about when you were writing this?
Well, brighter, definitely, and as well as broader. But essentially, funnily enough, I was thinking of most of us. This was written, it took 3 years to write, so it was conceived long before the pandemic came along. And as I was writing it and, putting together a lot of the chapters, the pandemic was, raging everywhere. And it stripped us, literally, of many of our social skills, which are imposed upon us by traditions and by the norms and by the environment and by social convention. All those things disappeared. And then suddenly, you find yourself asking, how do I behave? We face a brand new situation. We begin to lose touch with the skills which we normally have because they're not being supported anymore by the environment. And now we are sort of reconnecting with friends, and we're still not quite sure what's the acceptable norm. How much do we share? What do we say? Are we behaving okay to perhaps novel challenges? We don't know. So essentially, intentional, it's just this. It answers, if it has to answer any question at all, it answers the question of how do we behave in any of the many circumstances we meet through life. And my supposition is if we knew that perfectly, well, there you go. You have perfect choices, perfect decision making, and a perfect life. You make no mistakes.
I think one of the negative fallouts of all of us pretty much working at home these days, it seems, is we can be working all the time. And we actually, you alluded to this a little bit in conversation before we got into the interviews. Like for me, I'm a hardcore work all the time person, so I don't always necessarily take as good of care of myself as I should. So talk to us a little bit about like being intentional about finding me time, as we might call it, but
Yeah,
to sit down and read a book like Intentional, and to wrestle with a chapter and try to put what we're learning to work. Because again, now that our workplace is in our home for many of us, we can feel like we're always at the office.
absolutely. I mean, this is a huge challenge. Let's strip everything you said back to its core, right? We Before the pandemic, we used to fetishize work. We used to have a leaderboard: who worked most hours or the hardest, who slept the least, who traveled the most air miles, who spent the most nights, waiting for flights at airports. And that used to be kind of status-based approach to life, which gave us perhaps credibility in our work, but it gave us status and I worked really hard. And we hope that this also began to sort of filter through in perhaps our earnings, which make everything justifiable, or at the very least in the respect we commanded. And here's the thing about all this: we were conditioned to behave like this because everybody else behaved like that as well. These were external forces which applied to us from outside. We accepted them, internalized them, and projected them back into the group. The pandemic comes along, as you say, and it strips us of all that. We realize we can work a lot better from home. There's a lot less stress. But now we also have to work out the work-life balance. Do we work all the time because we're never away from our place of work? And this is where our own set of responsibility comes in. This is where intentionality comes in. If you're going to work, in any given day, 12 hours in the day, it has to be because you chose to do that for a very specific reason. And if you do that, you're aware of what the reason is. You know what the intention, what the outcome of that is going to be. You know what you're aiming for, and you want to get it. So, perhaps you need to finish a project by a deadline, you need to do something, but you're not really doing it to gain brownie points because the visibility of that action doesn't exist anymore. You can't really brag about it because you're at home, you're on your own, you're working. It's not very glamorous. You're not traveling anywhere. So you don't do it for those reasons. So now you have a real reason to do it. When there's no real reason to do it, then you owe it to yourself not to do that. Because essentially, if you do it, what are you doing? You are damaging, for lack of a better word, the fundamental unit that makes up everything else, makes up your social group, your family group, your work group. Each of us is a unit in that whole. We owe it to ourselves to look out for ourselves, to be as functional, as perfect as we can be, and also to look out for other people around us. So if you see somebody burning the candle at both ends for no reason at all, simply because they're not aware of alternatives, now is the time to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't be doing this if it's not getting you where you want to. So there.
Yeah, no, and I feel like that it's actually a badge of honor, or whatever we wanted to call it. Like, that comes at a great cost. I feel like it's something when we're coming up and in our 20s and 30s, we can steal from father time. We can steal from our the resources of our body. And I feel like as we get older, our body says, nope, that just doesn't work anymore. So even if in our minds we feel like we don't want to slow down, we're going to have to slow down and figure things out eventually, or just come to some kind of a crisis point where we're forced to deal with it.
Yeah, we'll break down, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned this about age, because there's a thing here. If we sort of accepted in the past, up to the in 1970s, where the average lifespan was about 67, 68, you retired at 65, within 2-3 years you were dead. They could afford to give you a massive pension because you wouldn't be there to draw it forever. Or if we go further back, when perhaps the average lifespan was about 55, you know, going flat out all your adult young life was fine because you wouldn't really suffer many consequences afterwards, right? You didn't have a lot of time for that. But these days we live to 80, 90, the people living to the age of 100, and that appears to be the norm. So maybe, you're looking at maybe, 20, 30 years after you're 60, which you need to be able to function as fully and capably as you can. So essentially, being intentional in your life now is an investment which you're making for your future self. And you really need to do that because you still need to be part of society. You can't be dragging it down. You still need to be part of your family group. You need to be able to enjoy life. Otherwise, there's no point to it. So, we need to change the way we perceive these things now.
and one of the things I appreciated about how you've designed the book is that we get to each kind of go through a process of experimenting and find out what works well for us. You don't have just, oh, David Amerland's 3 steps for solving that and 5 steps for solving this. And I know for some people, they're going to like that dynamic, maybe chaotic aspect of it. Other people, they're like, no, I need the 3 steps. So why did you leave the journey with this book a little more open-ended for the reader?
Okay, I really struggle with this. Sometimes it's easy for me to be very prescriptive and say, listen, this is the 3 things you need to do. Now, first of all, it's it's the huge sort of ego boost when you do that, because you set yourself up as the ultimate authority.
You're the expert. You know it all.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And we know for a fact that even the best writers are not the absolute experts on this. They bring in an informed perspective. They put in their own opinion, their research, and everything. But ultimately, it has to come down to the reader. Now, the reason I left it like that, and I really struggle on how to actually structure the last part of each chapter. And in order to be most useful, I thought, you provide a tool, which is a question, and then you allow that question to basically ferment in the reader's mind, and they'll come up with their own solutions which work for them. And to me, that's the most valuable thing a book can do. Because we have research which shows now that, you read a book, you finish the book, you don't remember anything you've read, you remember sort of bits and pieces. However, it's changed you inside your brain. It's rewired you, because while you're going through it, your brain is making new connections. It's putting together memories which you had. It's formulating those memories into new models, which the book allows you to actually see. And when it does that, your brain changes. So now, with your changed brain, even though you can't remember anything about the book, you look at the reality in front of you and you perceive it differently. And if you perceive it differently, then you are ready to act differently upon what you see. So this is my intention. Essentially, after each chapter, I want you to think, okay, this is the summary of the chapter. This is what I've learned. And how do I then use that to change, to rewire my own perception, my own brain, my own reality?
And in terms of reading the book, you also leave it open that we don't have to read it sequentially. Another thing that some people are going to be fine with, and it's going to make other people nervous. Again, why open-ended in that fashion as well?
Well, each chapter, the book's about 218 pages. And, I could have easily made it 3 times that volume and still not be complete in every respect. There's masses of research, a lot of stuff we know about each aspect of what makes us us. And when I was putting it together, I condensed a lot of the things. I gave a lot of examples, I popularized some of the things, and I struggled a lot to find sort of ways to make it very accessible, because the research is extremely dense.
Sure.
And when I did that, I thought, okay, how would I benefit from a book like that if I was the reader? And my idea was, I sort of am sort of in a sort of halfway journey where I know some things and I don't know some things, and I know I don't know some things. There's some things which I don't know, and I don't know that I don't know them. So I thought, if instead of making the video go through the conventional thing where you start with chapter 1, you have to get to, chapter 12, and you say, okay, this is where now I understand it. No, just dip into any chapter, start reading it. It will connect things in your head. And then if you're going to sort of, take the entire book apart, make notes everywhere, great. If you only want to go through 3-4 chapters, which are relevant to you, I think that's fantastic.
Well, I think that really speaks to how we access and how we take in information these days, where we want to get to information that deals with, solves the problem that we're trying to figure out. And traditionally, that's not how we laid out books. I mean, it's just it feels kind of illogical, but at the same time, maybe that's just because I work in publishing. For the user, so to speak, or the reader who's experiencing it, that's exactly how they access information on the internet or wherever else they're trying to go to solve a problem. So, in some ways, I do wonder if this could become more of the norm. And it almost kind of feels like a choose your own adventure book all over again.
Yeah, it does. And you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought of it or analyzed it very much in terms of that. But, subconsciously, I use information in the same way as you do. As you say, technology has changed it. And if you have a lot of information at your fingertips, you have to be selective in how you actually use it so it actually becomes relevant to you. Otherwise, you're going to be lost chasing things down rabbit holes and, pretty much lose your entire life without getting anywhere. So that essentially informed a lot of my decisions without me being 100% conscious of them at the time.
Well, and David, I just appreciate you bringing up the phrase, chasing or going down rabbit holes. I use that all the time on the podcast. Although, ironically, I was interviewing a guy from New Zealand the other week, and he used the phrase "rabbit warren." That was new to me. I'd not ever heard that. Just I was like, okay, I know what he's talking about, but that blessed me too that he used that in that interview. Let's jump into identity. Um, you didn't specifically cover this in the book, but I actually talk about this a lot in my context, in terms of, and this applies here in the States. I think it applies to other parts of the world as well, where the family is so fractured, culture and society is so fractured, where identity wise, many of us have lost our connection to our family traditions, the traditions of our state or our country. We really don't know our history all that well. We feel disconnected from culture. So, in terms of kind of creating a vacuum of identity, to lose that mooring to all those things that historically, at least on the front end, helped us to understand who we were. Like, what's some of the fallout from that? Because I feel like that's a pretty universal experience right now for a lot of people.
It is, and I think in your summary, you've hit the nail on the head in a really specific way. Essentially, this loss of identity has been a process. It didn't happen overnight and didn't happen at once, but it's been a gradual process of our technologically driven life, which is faster and faster, which allows us to be more mobile. It allows us to fragment. It allows us to lose touch with tradition. And the moment we do that, although we don't realize it, we lose part of the code which surrounds us, which tells us how to behave. Traditions essentially are coded forms of knowledge from the past, which allows us to see what is the norm, how to behave in a situation, how do we then assess what we see. Now, we need that guidance because every time we come up against a situation in our brain, we need to basically assess, is it a threat, is it an opportunity? How do we behave? How do we navigate it? And it's energetically costly. If we're already stressed out with other things, it becomes almost impossible to handle. And sometimes we break down because of that, and our brains become damaged, and we become damaged, and our behavior then, which is externalized, is anything but social. So family used to shield us in the past. Community used to shield the family. Society around that community used to shield each community. So essentially, we had a multi-layered approach where everything fed into everything else, and it allowed us to feel safe enough in order to develop, to make mistakes, to recover from those mistakes, and take risks. Fast forward to today. Well, communities have been fragmented in themselves, families have been fragmented. We find ourselves moving around very quickly in different situations. We have no grasp of the past. And as you said, crucially, sometimes we don't have any knowledge of history or adequate knowledge of history in order to say, okay, we've seen this before. So each time we are faced with a situation which is novel to us, we have no guidance. Usually the stakes are fairly high in terms of perhaps, career or reputation or identity or all those things which we build up in our head and we think are important. And then we have to make choices and they have to make decisions. And usually our choices and decisions in that context are understandably wrong. We get crazy things there, for instance, okay? And I'm not taking a dig here at flat earthers. There are people like us who are using a belief system to create a community which supports who they think they are. I think we have to respect that. At the same time, from a scientific point of view, it's a crazy belief which has risen out of this fragmentation. And if we see our response to it, people who are like us, who, live, breathe, have the same concerns as we do, the same needs as we do, and our usual response to it is ridicule and isolation. I think, this is like, whoa, if we take this into anthropological context, we are being unintentionally perhaps cruel because we also feel challenged by somebody's crazy beliefs. We think, why should this even be happening? Or we're so much better off, or we're safer, we're smarter, we are, better somehow. And that helps us create a safe space for us. And again, these things, which, we had instances in the past where tribes would exile somebody, societies would exile somebody, the church would excommunicate somebody. We had these things, which are mechanisms, but we didn't have them in such broad sort of social groups where, we applied it and cut them off. We need to do better than this. We need to be better than this. It needs to start from us. If we don't start internalizing these truths, if we don't start at an individual level to understand, first of all, who we are, because we can't understand that, then we can't understand other people. So if we don't really understand who we are, then we can't extend the courtesy of understanding and perhaps acceptance and forgiveness and respect or whatever it is that we need to do to other people. And if we can't do that, we can never really meet them halfway. We can't empathize with them, which means we can't trust them. Anybody we can't trust, we can't deal with. Can't deal with them, then it's a case of us and them. And we see this every day in different contexts in our society, in every country, irrespective of, the sort of how well off the country is, how rich the people, or how poor.
And in terms, and I think you and I have talked about this in previous interviews to some extent, but in terms of that kind of loss of what would have historically been a core identity piece, is some of that maybe due to the fact that we are a global society now and we're still trying to figure out what that really means? And then also, in terms of information overload, 45, 50 years ago, I wouldn't have known or needed to know that the flat earthers exist or that it was something I should worry about. So on the one hand, we have all these new inputs coming into our life that we never had before. And then, we're doing life with people all over the globe. And so maybe that sense of whatever it means to be a global citizen or have an identity as a global person, maybe we haven't written that yet, so we're not sure what to do with it. Would love your thoughts on that.
Well, definitely, this is a new chapter in our life. The challenge we face right now is twofold. First of all, how we internalize these things, so the things which we know about ourselves. How do we do the hard digging as to find out who we truly are, what our values really are, what our beliefs really are? Where do we draw the lines for ourselves first? Where does our morality lie? If we don't know that, then we're back to the thing where it says, if you don't know where you're going, every road will get you there. Okay, so we need to know that. And the moment we need to know that, then we're going to say, okay, the challenge of scale, as you rightly said, in terms of society, in terms of the world, in terms of community, is a huge challenge because it makes the boundaries which used to be there, the perceived boundaries, so family, community, life, personal space, etc. It makes them more porous and sometimes makes them disappear altogether. And the moment it does that, obviously it challenges a little bit of identity. It brings in fresh values, it brings in fresh ideas, it brings in fresh ways of working, fresh ways of seeing reality. If we're not comfortable with that discomfort, if we don't find a way to deal with it collectively, individually, we're always threatened by it. If you come in today and tell me, hey, David, I read your book and here's 3 different things which I think could have been done differently. Okay, if I don't accept that in terms of your perceived knowledge, etc., if I just take it that you don't know what you're talking about, I'll see that as a threat. So then my reaction would be adverse, right? I'd be like, I'm going to try to immediately somehow make you feel lower in your knowledge, in your appearance, or whatever, in order to diminish your value, which then diminishes the value of your opinion, which then makes the attack, a lot less powerful. Stupid way of operating, right? I agree. It exists within us at a fundamental level, at a sort of visceral level, if you like, because it's an emotional response to a perceived threat. So we need now to be able to better understand what is a threat, what is an opportunity, and how do we better deal with it instead of immediately going to the fight or flight response. And that comes down to emotional regulation. Emotional regulation can't happen without empathy. Empathy can't happen without trust, which takes us back to the original thing, which means I need to be able to see you first as another person. If I'm stuck on your label, whatever your job description is, or if I'm stuck on your, perhaps skin color or your ethnicity or whatever, I'm not seeing you as a person. I'm seeing you as a potential threat. I'm always on the lookout. I'm always filtering what you're saying. I'm always ready for the perceived slide, for the perceived attack. So this takes us into an entirely different sphere of interaction. And it is possible for us to interact at a high threat level because, as you say, we've never met, so I haven't really shared the space with you. I may not have an advanced enough perception of your ethnicity, so I may be stuck in my head with whatever stereotypes I have in my head. So, there's a lot of things here which we need to be able to develop further as part of our own evolution, and then to consciously use to overcome our biases, which exist for a reason, overcome our sense of threat, which exists for a reason, and the reason is, to help us survive, and understand that really long-term survival means we need to work differently now.
And I promise we will move on from identity, but I wrote down so many notes from that chapter.
Right. Okay.
I really liked the part of the chapter where you had the three constituents of identity:
Hmm.
how we view ourselves, how others view us. But and you already kind of alluded to this, and I want to process it through a lens of how we behave because of the way we think others view us. If we try
Yes.
to put that in our current context where we've lost all the cues of functioning out in what was normal before in society, going shopping or going to church or going to the office with our coworkers, so much of that has been just like we're having this conversation in front of a laptop or a phone or a tablet. Um, how has behavior maybe shifted, and how do we need to be aware of how we're operating because of the way we think others view us now in this shifted context? I mean, I know everybody's wearing pajama pants at home all day long now, even when they're on
Yes.
Zoom, but and that's inconsequential. But long term, we do have to figure out what it
Hmm.
means to operate like this.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said all that. Now, essentially, going to the office, going to church, perhaps going down to the local pub. These are social activities which allows us to have in-group ties, which establish a common understanding of reality, which is, common enough for everybody to accept. So although perhaps we wouldn't all agree specifically on every specific detail of it, we would agree broadly, this is what it is, this is what's good, this is what is bad about it. This broad understanding allowed us to communicate because we were able to establish this common understanding, and a shared language behind it, which essentially also leads to empathy and trust. And what is empathy? We need to explain this now here. Empathy essentially is the ability to think how somebody else thinks and feel how they feel for the specific reason of being able to predict their reaction to something which you're going to do or going to say, or something which they experience. Being able to predict that means I can trust you, or I can trust them. Why? Because they're going to have predictable behavior. So if I know, if I come to you and say, hey, I've read this fantastic book and I tell you what it is, I know that, you're going to process in a certain way and your reaction is going to be predictable within a certain range of accepted sort of responses. And we're going to have fantastic conversation, which will both hopefully benefit from. That's fantastic. I have that trust, which means I'm going to be open. If I don't know how you're going to react at all to this, I'm going to be really hesitant sharing anything with you, which means the conversation is going to be stilted. I'm going to listen for cues. I'm going to sort of double think about everything. And I'm going to filter everything through my own perception of mistrust on you. Now, you said, what happened? We lost the common ground. We don't go to the office anymore. So we lost touch with each other. We don't go to the pub anymore because, coronavirus, and we had restrictions. We don't travel out of our homes anymore. We don't travel across the globe to meet everybody. Well, what happens is that we still feel the same need to connect. We still feel the same need to establish that common understanding. But now we're in a minefield because we are not sure how much we can say and how little we can say. We don't know how people see us because we have no idea what we're projecting. We don't know if what we are giving them as an image is good enough or is acceptable. And it's scary. What's the answer to this? Well, the answer is essentially, fall back on the fundamentals, right? If I accept that I'm a human at the most basic form, I bleed when I get cut, I get cold when I'm not wearing clothes, I get hungry and I need food. And that's my common thing with you. And we build from that. So if we go from there, suddenly we're both two humans living on a certain planet, have some things in common in terms of our biology, have some things in common in terms of our neurobiology, which is shared. And then everything else, we'll think, okay, we can now work it out because you're in a different context to me, and I need to be able to understand and internalize that. And I'm in a different context to you. So, where you are, it might be, I don't know, -1 and snowing out there. Where I am, it might be in the Caribbean, and it might be like, 27 centigrade and sunny. So our responses to the environment are going to be different. I'm going to be chilled and more relaxed. You're going to be a bit more tense because it's cold and you're uncomfortable. If I internalize and understand that, then that's a human response. I think, okay, that's how we communicate. We need to be able to trust ourselves first and each other as people. And this is, it's such an easy thing to say. It seems so common sense and common, it's fundamental. And we are finding it really difficult. And we need to be able to do this asynchronously sometimes, or digitally in real time. And we need to actually make it work. It takes effort. It is eminently doable. Because it takes effort, it is, for lack of a better word, intentional, right? Because it leads to specific sort of goals and outcomes.
Yeah, and I think to some degree, just like anything else, you're going to get out of something what you actually invest or pour into it. And so, if we don't just have kind of those same standards that we had of showing up on time to a meeting when we were in the office or making sure we're presentable. I mean, don't show up to every meeting in our pajamas. Like also there's just, timeliness, appearance, all the cues that we are able to have, I would say are more important now because we've lost so many of the other cues now that we're just operating out of this different context. Last question related to this section of the book, and then we'll move on. I really like that you had something at the close of that chapter about finding your mantra or some truth that when we get life kicks us off the path of like being secure in our identity, having some kind of a truth statement, something we can just recite to ourselves to kind of get back on the path and back onto, okay, even though I'm not feeling this right now, this is what's reality, or this is what I'm aspiring towards. So talk to us a little bit about the importance of having truths to get ourselves back where we should be.
Yeah. Okay, let's consider that each of us is a biological entity that has specific intrinsic and extrinsic value which we must safeguard. So what do we need to do? Well, if we're an alien being investing in biological units of this kind, who are extremely expensive to bring up and they're very fragile, as it were, I would need to make sure that my investment in them is safeguarded by having a medical team around them or psychological team around them, special dietitians, special trainers, so they're in tip-top condition, and obviously some really cool educators which help them get the skills they need in order to function. Okay, harsh reality, we don't have any of those things. We are born, if we're lucky, our family gives us some kind of guidance, our education gives us some kind of guidelines, people around us. If we find mentors, say, hey, watch out for this and, do this. And this is the thing you say yes to. But if we don't have any mentors, we have to blunder through our own life and write our own manual for it. So what can we do? Well, we have to be our own mentors. We have to be our own coaches. And there's a psychological effect known as distancing, where you talk to yourself in the third person. And this is what happens. And it's quite fascinating when you look at the spectroscopy and the studies, which fMRI studies on this. The brain experiences a kind of problem. The problem is becoming overwhelming. Because it's you and you find the problem overwhelming, what is it that you know about yourself? I'll tell you what you know intimately. All your failings, all your lack of knowledge, all your lack of experience, all the times you failed in the past. All those things you know intimately. And they all stack up and stack up and stack up. And they make a massive wall which you can't overcome. And that's on top of the problem which you're facing. So now what are you saying to yourself? Well, I'm not good enough. I'm going to fail in this. And you know what? I deserve to fail. Except if inside ourselves, that's all we can see. But suppose now you step outside yourself and you say to yourself, hey, David, hey, Shaun, it's not so bad because you faced problems like this before. And it may be true, it may not be, maybe, a kind of bending the truth or, but it may be close enough. But the moment you say that, you decompress the pressure which you feel, and the pressure which you feel is neurobiological. So there it has a neurochemical element in it. So the stress hormones begin to drop. Your heartbeat, which is elevated, begins to drop. The moment these things happen, you take deeper breaths, you oxygenate your bloodstream, and higher centers of analysis and thinking in your brain, which had shut down because they're providing the blood flow to centers which had to deal with the crisis and the fight or flight response, now come into play. So now, with this kind of thinking, which is now augmented, you look at the same reality, same facts, and you begin to see different perspectives. You begin to find options which perhaps you didn't see before. And all you had to do was say, hey, get a grip, for instance. Hey, you are better than this. Hey, you can do this. In the Matrix, what happens? We have Trinity in the beginning, one of the Matrix 1. She's being chased by Agent Smith and his cohorts. She goes across rooftops, does the impossible, spins in the air, goes through a window, falls down a staircase, lands on her back, guns ready, frozen with fear. Because she knows that if an agent goes through, nobody survived that. And what does she say to herself? Get up, Trinity. She talks to herself in the third person. And when that happens, it freezes, it unfreezes rather, the fear response. It keeps her in frozen state so she can take action. So her motivation comes in. That's a classic example of this effect.
Well, when all good examples go back to the Matrix, I think all of us who love that film are definitely happy. I like the example you gave in terms of like as we state something or kind of jar ourselves out of the place we're stuck. It's you're slightly pivoting the lens you're looking through, or you've reframed something in your mind enough that you can see that you actually have options. Like you're getting out of that place of I'm stuck and this is just awful and there's nowhere to go, just that slight pivot, or maybe just taking the time to kind of get outside of yourself and step away can allow you to see that there actually are options on the table and that not all is lost. Well, let's move on to the chapter about motivation. I was intrigued to see that you had stuff in that chapter relating to planning. If you fail to have a plan, you can plan that you're gonna be able to fail. And as somebody who works with lots of authors and creatives, I was struck by how often creatives struggle to plan. It's not a high area of gift or want I see with a lot of the creative folks, but I would love to have you just talk a little bit about connecting motivation to planning, and then a little bit about why planning is critical because it gives us order and structure, a map of what if we don't is just complex and chaotic. We're to the point where we can't even deal with it. So
Yes.
connect all those pieces for me, David.
Okay. Let's look at the motivation. Huge subject, right? It's dopamine based. Largely, it activates the brain's reward system in any kind, shape, or form. Motivation, in order to lead to action, leads us from a place of discomfort to a place of comfort. Or even if we have fresh discomfort, it's of a lower degree than what we experienced before. So essentially, it's better. It always leads us from a situation that is worse to a situation which is better. This is what we need to know about it. In order for us to do anything, that has to build up in our mind. The moment it builds up, it reaches a particular threshold, then we move to action. We have no choice. Once the firing mechanism in our brain happens, we're going to take some kind of action. In order for us to have meaningful action, in order for the action, the next bit we do, in order for it to take us away from discomfort and take us towards a place where we experience less discomfort or greater comfort, we need to have some kind of plan. Because the plan is what? I know what I'm experiencing it, I'm internalizing it, I'm analyzing it. I know that now I need to act to experience something which is less painful. And what are my options on this? I need to be able to assess them. And the moment I assess them, then those options themselves are broken down into steps. Those steps become your plan. This is the same whether you're writing a non-fiction book or a fiction book or whatever. And I know the old argument about creatives is, oh, I don't like to be led, I like to be surprised. Well, you'll still be surprised by that. You're creating a structure and a skeleton, but you need to flesh it out. There's plenty of room for surprise. What happens if you don't have a plan is that you hit a block, and that completely demotivates you and undermines your confidence in yourself as a writer, and you hit writer's block. And you say, well, I can't write now, I hit writer's block. Well, where is that thing? That thing is what we experience when you step out of your house, you know you need to get somewhere, but you're in a brand new place, and you don't know how to get there. But without a map, without some kind of navigation, you have no plan. So how are you going to get there? You won't be able to take a single step in any direction because all those steps will be equally right and equally wrong. But if you say, hey, at least I know where I'm going, it's going to be east. Straight away, you're going to head east and you're going to work it out along the way. But you have some kind of plan which allows you then to say, okay, I hit this obstacle. This is how I'm going to go around it. I'm still going to head east, for instance. So that's how motivation works. This is why planning is crucial. We have given planning sometimes a bad rep because we tend to overplan things, and then they tend to lock us, we perceive, into a mode of behavior. Well, that also is wrong. Your planning has to be fluid enough to allow for the intricacies of each situation which you encounter. So, and that takes confidence in yourself. It takes confidence in your ability. Sometimes those who overplan are so scared of what to do next. They need to work out every single detail and follow it. Like it's so prescriptive that it doesn't allow any room for surprises, because surprises surprise us and make it difficult for us to navigate something. We need to be able to develop the confidence we need to deal with that.
Well, and that makes me think of a best-selling book from another David Allen, his book "Getting Things Done." I mean, where in the early stages of his methodology, you would be pulling all the random things that were hanging out in your head that you're having to expend all this emotional energy to work on or worry about or figure out. And if we're entering into a creative pursuit and we don't have a plan or a map, we're having to hold all this stuff in our mind, and all of our emotional energy is just up there having to juggle things, as opposed to if we put it someplace else where it can be on the shelf or off to the side, we'll actually have more emotional energy to actually press in to being more creative. And I feel like that's something that coming up in business context for the past decade plus, that's a normal thing that I learned about early on. I feel like for a lot of people, especially creatives who didn't maybe have the benefit of leadership training and kind of stuff that's the norm in more of a corporate space, that's something that they maybe stumble into after they've been frustrated for a long time. I don't know if you've seen that with creative people you've coached and worked with.
I have, yes. And writer's block and how you get over it is one of the most common questions that people send me. And sometimes they say, have you hit it ever? And the answer is never, right? But that doesn't mean that I always know what I want to write. Sometimes in my head, my thinking is muddled and I'm blocked and I don't know how to express something. And what I do then is I write. And I may write, 2, 3, 4,000 words and maybe complete rubbish. But by the time that process of writing has worked out what's rubbish and what isn't, then I can scrap those 4,000 words. And now I know how to write 2,000 words actually a lot better. But, I've had to go through that process of, basically structuring my thinking. And that is also planning because, when you're writing in any kind of form, you create a structure whether you want to or not. Otherwise, the writing doesn't work. So, whether you do it consciously or subconsciously, or, whether you sort of do it in a very methodical way, or you do it in a sort of more haphazard way where you're feeling your way along, planning has to be there, which means in order for the plan to work, you need a direction. And, if we apply this to life, we need a direction to our life, which means that we need to know what's important to us, which means we need to know what's of value to us, and then what is of value to those around us, which we deliver as a result.
And I'll say one of the things I really appreciated journeying through your new book is you forced me to wrestle with terms and phrases that I thought I knew the answer. Like, I know what this means, but there are so many things we take into our vocabulary and we use, but we've never actually thought about, well, what am I really saying? Or what does this really mean? And so because of all that, I'd like to have you talk about grit next. I feel like we might know of a book or two that has that in the title. Maybe we think of that John Wayne movie from back in the day, True Grit. But most of us haven't actually tried to figure, well, what does that mean? Is it important? Do I have grit? So talk to us a little bit about what is grit and why is it actually important?
Okay, well, grit is a character trait. And I'll put an aside here that, the behavior which we ascribe to a person, which we call character, we ascribe to a company and we call it culture. And we ascribe to a nation and we call it tradition and history. So basically it's all behavior, right? So it's how you behave. And you say, okay, grit. If you look at Captain America, for instance, there's a classic thing where he gets knocked down. He's fighting somebody who's a lot stronger than him. And, this is his life story. That's how he started out, right? So, as Captain America, he's super powerful, but when he's fighting against Iron Man, he's still going to get knocked down. So, and he says, he picks himself up and he's hurt. And he says, I can do this all day. Okay, that's grit. Okay, he's displaying grit there. Okay, but what does that actually mean? It's not being hard-headed and not giving up. It's not knocking your head against the wall time and again, thinking the wall is going to crumble. And it's not something which, sort of magically is acquired because, you force yourself to do it. Grit is a way of dealing with life where you put in your confidence in yourself and you establish your values and you say, these are my values and I'm willing to not give up on them. I'm willing not to give up on myself. So it's in many ways, it's a belief in yourself, in your own worth, in your own abilities, in your own capability to learn and develop and thrive as opposed to just survive. And that's what we established. When it comes to, Captain America, he's fighting for his values, he's willing to die for them, basically. We think he's hard-headed. Well, he's willing to do what it takes because he's not willing to back down from what is right. That's the kind of grit that enables us to push through obstacles in life.
And in terms of grit, that chapter comes later in the book. We've said you don't have to read the book straight through. You could just jump right to grit if that's what you want to know about. But displaying that or operating from a place of grit, so to speak, is that easier once we start to figure out our identity and some of the things you have earlier in the book?
Yes. Well, identity is core. It's key. If we go back to the time of the Delphic Oracle with Apollo, it's on the Delphic Oracle. It says Pythia was the head priestess, and before you enter into the forecourt, it's written in stone: "Know thyself." Now, why did they ask you to do that? Because essentially, you are going to go there and ask a specific question. They'll give you an answer which can be interpreted in many different ways, right? And the interpretation which you're going to give is basically based upon your own perception of who you are and what reality you inhabit. So knowing yourself is key. This is, we think of ourselves as an entity. That entity is made up of many different layers: aspirations, hopes, training, social status, social experience, and so on, all those things, right? If we think about all that, who we are really is the heart of the onion. That's the one bit which is, if you start cutting that up, the onion's going to disappear. So we can peel all the layers and keep on peeling. We get to the heart and we still have an onion. Take the heart away and you have nothing. Now, that's why knowing yourself, that's why knowing who you really are, really, truly, what you really want. What are you prepared to sacrifice to get it? What is your sense of right and wrong? Where is your moral compass? These are deep questions. We don't normally ask these of ourselves. Society supplies them for us. We go to school, they tell us, hey, you are, this, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, for instance. Okay, you accept that as your identity, which comes with a whole set of values on that. Or, if you're in a different nation, you're this, or a different nation is that. But what if we don't have that, which is external? Who are we in ourselves? And how do we define that? How do we make sure we are making the right choices, living the right life? Well, ultimately, only we can answer that. And we have to really push ourselves internally to sort of internalize that journey in order to see what the values are.
And this is kind of an aside. I wrote this down, although it was part of the grit chapter. It was in the reminder bullet points at the end. We index the information of the world around us, so to speak, through narrative. And just as a guy who spent a decade plus in software companies and makes his living basically working on the web, when I think of indexing stuff, it's disconnected from story. So that just caught my attention right away. So talk to us a little bit about indexing stuff through narrative, so we can, is that to categorize it, make sense of it, know how to operate within it, all of the above?
All of the above. Essentially, who we are is a story. Okay, if I ask you, how was your day today? I mean, here are the facts of your day. You woke up, your temperature was so, particularly at this particular level. You were hungry, you ate something, you went to the bathroom, brushed your teeth, shaved, etc., and off you went to work. These are things, right? This is not what you're going to tell me. This is not the facts you're going to tell me. You're going to say how you woke up and you were tired from the night before because, you spent until 3 a.m. working for your project, and the project is critical. You almost finished it. And today you grab a cup of coffee, run over there, and you dramatize it, right? Why do you have to do that? Well, for 2 reasons. First of all, because your way of dramatizing it fits with my perception of how the world works, because we both work on the same wavelength. But secondly, by doing that, you're creating a specific identity for yourself where you are the hero of a story, where all these pressure points are being overcome through your own sense of perseverance, grit, and ingenuity, right? And we do the same thing about everything. And it doesn't matter how mundane our lives are, how mundane our stories are. Now, in our brain, inside our head, narrative creates the threads across data points which make things memorable for us. So the things which impact our sense of who we are most strongly are the ones which remember most easily. So if you had a childhood experience which impacted who you became today, you'll remember this just like that. Where if your childhood was, perfectly normal, nothing untoward happened, you were really happy there. If I say to you, what were you doing when you were 5 years old in December of that year? You're going to go, oh, I don't know. I was 5 years old. I was being a kid, because you can't remember anything about it, right? So your brain doesn't see why it should retain any sort of degree of clarity about those events or dramatize them in any way. So this is the way we create identity. We also create a similar narrative about the world at large. So essentially, we look at data points. We look at perhaps, where does the sun rise each day and why, what happens to the people when it rains, what happens to driving when you have really adverse weather conditions. And we create a narrative about all these things, which allows them to make sense. First of all, the energetic cost of processing all this information and retaining it becomes a lot lower because the narrative is there. It's easy for us to retain. We understand it better. We understand the picture better. We know how to navigate it better. And we know how to deal with any challenges it throws at us. And it does that at a really low cost. If we have to process every data point, it means we have to process all the permutations, all the different possibilities, all these things, and we'll just lock up in our brain. We won't be able to leave the house in the morning. So that's why narrative is how we take in data from outside, we put a story about it, retain it, function with it until we have to change it because we met some plot point, for lack of a better word, which allows us either to expand or narrow down our narrative and introduce fresh characters and so on.
Well, let's jump all the way to the end of the book. You've got a chapter on happiness.
Happy ending. That's a happy ending.
The happy ending to the book. Talk to us a little bit about kind of the chemical brain science of happiness, how that relates to the personal experience of happiness, and then connect that into how can we engineer the process to help us experience more happiness on an ongoing basis?
Right. Essentially, happiness is driven by dopamine, noradrenaline, serotonin, and these are the sort of chemicals which activate the reward system in the brain and make us feel in a state of internal grace, if you want. We feel good, we feel happy, we feel that the world is just. We see everything with different perspective when we have those chemicals streaming in our bloodstream. One of the factors which makes those chemicals flow is novelty. So if we meet a new situation, a new experience, we feel drawn to it as long as it's not overtly threatening because those chemicals are activated. We are a naturally curious species because of this kind of chemical process. When we go from a state where we experience discomfort to a place of comfort, which is our motivation for most things, again, we feel a degree of happiness. If you need to choose a washing machine, for instance, and your wife charges you with that, right? You don't have a washing machine, you need there's discomfort. You need to pick one now, and you know that when you picked one, there'll be great comfort because your wife will think you're great, and you think, okay, I've done this job, and this is part of my job description. And you go through all the permutations. What are the washing machine sizes, makes, prices, delivery times, guarantees, after sales service, all those things, right? You make a choice, you get a washing machine, immediately happy, right? Like amazing. Well, all you've done is solve something functional. But this is not how you feel about this. You actually feel a sense of achievement. You feel a sense of, I solved this. And, somehow inside our brains, it's amazing. It's like magic because of this thing. We feel happy when we are, and happiness is not an end state, obviously. It's a process. It can repeat again and again on different things, but we feel happy when we are evolving, when we're becoming, when we're overcoming, which is why, people who sometimes have had it fairly hard in their lives, and they get to a state where, it's not so hard anymore, but it's, they haven't reached the pinnacle of their career or their lives, they can still be fairly happy. They've overcome all this adversity. You get marathon runners who haven't won, but they finished the race and they didn't think they would, and they feel happy about it. Same reason. So essentially, this is important to understand because we have this false identity, this false image of happiness as a place. Some kind of spot we all need to arrive at. And once we arrive at, that's it. We're going to be parked there for the rest of our lives. Well, that's not going to happen ever, right? Because this is not how happiness works. And if that's what you expect, and again, we've been conditioned in the past, how many fairy tales said, and they lived happily ever after. Well, how did they do that exactly? Because, they only overcame this obstacle to get there. Are they going to be happily ever after because of that? That's unrealistic. So unrealistic expectations have been set up. We expect to get married and be happily ever after. Well, how? Because, the challenge is just beginning. If you don't have a process to deal with the challenges, to make the shared journey with somebody else truly a shared journey, well, you're not going to be happy together. You're going to have problems. So we need to rethink what we understand as happiness to be. Can we be happy? Yes. Can we always be happy? No. Because, as you're going through a process, you're not experiencing happiness, but you're going to experience happiness. So there you go.
Well, and I just feel compelled to go in this direction. Talk a little bit about creating an environment where happiness is more possible. I mean, we try to improve our environment so we work more effectively, or we can exercise more effectively. I would love to hear a little bit. How do we set up our environment for the most likely outcome of happiness?
Well, what is the question? Let's turn this question on its head, right? And
Yeah.
say, what is the energetic cost of you being where you are? And if you say to me, look, I'm in a special room in my house, I have to make sure that, windows don't creak, there's no draft coming in because the draft right now, I have to make sure I have proper lighting, I have to make sure there's, enough electricity for what I'm doing. And the internet must be on, and if I have to work really hard for all those things, the energetic cost is huge. So doing what we're doing right now is at a great cost to you. And it becomes really difficult. And if you have to set it up every time as you approach the interview time, it appears like a mountain, especially if you're tired at the end of your day and you have to do this now, right? You have to set up electricity somehow, you have to set up the internet somehow, you have to set up the lights, you have to put the draft excluders in place, you have to ask the neighbors not to let off fireworks, all those things, right? Now imagine you had to do all those things. You wouldn't be able to have the number of interviews you have. Or imagine you go to your desk, you turn on your laptop, your camera is there, your light setup is there, your chair is there, and all you've got to do is interview somebody and listen to what they say and ask questions which will elicit more value from their answers. Okay, that's what you're there to do. If you can do that, then suddenly you're happier. The person you're interviewing is happier, and you've achieved something at relatively low energetic cost. Well, that's your environment. And if we apply the same logic to everything we do, then we're talking about how we're optimizing our lives so we can perform better. If you enter your house every time and the door creaks, I mean, that's a minor annoyance, right? But on a day when you're really annoyed by traffic, by rain, by your workload, the fact you're going to have to work late and the door creaks, you filter it out. But in order to have that mental filter, you need to allocate mental resources because your brain hears it. So you need to filter it out. So you have a filter that maintains that. So then those resources are not allocated to something else which you need. And if you're really stretched thin on that day, you haven't got the available resources to be, the best possible version of you.
I like that. I think in terms of the creaking door, in my context, I don't want it to wake up my 2-year-old when he's having his nap. That's what I would worry about. Really along the whole journey with your book, I feel like you're inviting us into this process of deconstructing some things that need to be deconstructed, redefining or maybe understanding a term for the first time in a way that makes better sense for our context. I feel like in the process of doing some what you lay out in the book, we might come up against difficult things that we're remembering or things from our past. Because the places we're going when it comes to identity and some of these other core things, they are tied to kind of trigger events or pain points in the past. So as we're going through this process, and if we encounter some of those difficult things, how do we process? How do we deal with? I would just love a little bit of context and feedback for that, because inevitably, I think people are going to come up against some hard things as they're really, I feel like, rewriting their own narrative.
Yes, and it's really difficult. I totally accept that, and you're absolutely right. Okay, so let's examine a couple of things. First of all, most of us, or all of us, without exception really, are the result of everything that's gone on before. Life is difficult by definition, so there's going to be trauma, and traumas accumulate. So we have had a number of traumatic experiences, even some, maybe at childhood level where we weren't able to cope with them so well because we didn't have the experience. We may not have had support network or, whatever. So people go through life at different stages. We get to our stage in life. Those experiences haven't gone away. Those traumas haven't gone away. And usually what they do is they hold us back. They hold us back because we might be afraid, because we don't want to get hurt again, or we don't want to experience that level of discomfort. And we build them up in our minds, right? That's why they become mental traumas. We may feel that, we're not good enough because we've experienced that, and our own sort of self-image and self-esteem is suffered as a result. Or the usual case, if it has been a number of slights or a number of situations where we have been victimized, then we are caught up in a process of anger, Anger essentially turns a sense of victimization, which we feel, on its head, and it blasts it out in the world, which is our own defense mechanism, so we can cope. So that's what anger is to a certain extent. That again traps us into a mode of behavior. If we need to be heading towards the future. In order to head towards the future, we need to experience the present. But if the present is the direct product of the past, and we're locked in the past, we're not experiencing the present. We're basically reliving the past in different ways. So the future never happens. We never fulfill our potential. We'll never find our direction. We'll never be able to plan adequately for what's happening because we can't allocate the resources we need because we're feeling locked up in this anger. So if we were to say, how do you get past this, really? Well, this is the hardest thing you can do. And this is the easiest thing I can say, which is also the hardest thing you can do, which is you need to forgive yourself first. You need to forgive your own failings, forgive the fact that, sometimes you weren't as good as you thought you were. Sometimes you failed and you shouldn't have. You need to forgive it. It's in the past. You can't change it. If you keep reliving it, it only traps you in the past. Certainly learn from it. Don't forget it, but forgive it. And then extend that forgiveness to others around you. Somebody has wronged you and you feel really wrong because it's really wrong. Totally accept it and you're totally right. Should we forgive that person in terms of, or rather, should we forget the fact that person did something wrong? No, because right and wrong haven't gone away. They still exist in the world. Should we forgive them? Well, if it means that you let it go and you grow, yeah, forgive it. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for other people. You don't have to go up to them and say, hey, I forgive you. But really, truly forgive them. Forget what they did in terms of not let it affect you anymore and lock you into a kind of behavior. And then you can move on. And that's liberating yourself from the past. Not forgetting it, not creating a mental blank wall where the past doesn't exist and only living in the present. But you need to truly experience the present you're in now. And that's really hard. You need to analyze and say, how did I get here? Where do I go next? Why should I go on the next step? What is truly valuable to me? If all you can feel is anger inside you, if all you can feel is victimization because you've been wronged, well, you won't be able to see those things. And even if you see them, you're so locked up, you're so fighting with yourself, you haven't got the emotional energy necessary to take the steps that will lead you to your next best life. And really, if any of us have any kind of duty to the world, it's to live our next best life, always. If we're the best versions of ourselves possible at each stage, well, then we are the best versions of ourselves possible for each other. And the communities will form better, and the societies will form better, and the world becomes better, just like that.
Yeah, when we have better things to give away, so to speak, because we've done the work on self, it has a positive ripple effect on all those that we come into contact with. David, in terms of the reader's journey with the book, they spend the time, they put in the work. On the other side of working through intentional, how do you hope you've impacted them? What might their life look like on that other side of the journey?
Well, if you finish the book and you feel that suddenly you have become more accountable to yourself, more responsible for your actions, which means that your actions now have true meaning as opposed to being just throwaway acts of whatever, then that makes you truly valuable in yourself primarily, and then to the world. And that's what we need. We need each of us. We need to realize the value we have, not just realize it internally, but realize it and make it manifest itself. And if we do that, I mean, the world is elevated instantly. Okay, so that's a massive win for everybody. There's a phrase that, a tide raises all boats. That's what it is,
And David, in terms of the listeners, the viewers, connecting with you, finding out more about your books, where do we discover you on the web?
You can find me at davidamerland.com. I blog there on a number of topics, including intentional. You can find me on LinkedIn, where I share a lot of posts, a lot of insights. I do the same thing on Twitter, although, the 340 character limit lobotomizes me a little bit.
It's challenging.
It is, yes. You can find me on Instagram, where I share some of my, personal life there as well.
And like we do with every episode, we'll make it easy. We'll have links in the show notes to places where you can connect with David and places where you can pick up your very own copy of his new book. And I'll say it's a good read. It's entertaining. There's pictures and lots of helpful data. But at the same time, it's a good hard read that's going to make you work up a mental and emotional sweat. If you actually follow the steps, answer the questions, and really take that time to wrestle with it, I think you'll be very pleased with what's on the other side of the journey. So my challenge to my listeners and viewers, pick up a copy of Intentional, put in the time, and see what comes out on the other side of that. I think you are going to be excited about how your life's going to shift. And my notes are out of frame here. There we go. I don't even know why I need to have my notes to read my closing. Anyways, it's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with David Amerland. Once again, our book today was Intentional: How to Live, Love, Work, and Play Meaningfully. And David, I just want to say thank you so much for pouring into us today. It's always a pleasure. It's always an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.